I stood at the polished mahogany podium in the grand ballroom of the historic Boston Heritage Gala, looking out over a sea of the wealthiest, most influential people in Massachusetts. The air inside the sprawling, vaulted room was thick with the scent of imported white orchids and vintage champagne. 300 guests sat at perfectly round tables draped in heavy ivory silk, their crystal glasses catching the warm, golden light radiating from the towering chandeliers above. It was the most exclusive event of the season, a night designed to celebrate the charitable contributions of Boston's elite. Sitting dead center in the front row was my mother, Evelyn Bennett. She was wearing a custom-tailored $10,000 designer gown that shimmered like dark water under the stage lights. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture rigidly straight, and a massive diamond pendant rested against her collarbone. She was smiling, that practiced, hollow, high society smile she used whenever she wanted people to believe she was a benevolent, loving matriarch. Sitting right next to her was my younger brother, Nolan. He was 28 years old, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, casually scrolling through his smartphone and ignoring the room. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to formally announce the Bennett family's massive financial pledge to the Heritage Foundation. Evelyn had spent months orchestrating this exact moment, positioning herself to receive a standing ovation from the billionaires and politicians in the room. She thought she had completely broken me. She thought I was nothing more than the obedient, terrified scapegoat she had spent my entire life grinding into the dirt. But I was not holding a speech. My hands were resting on either side of the podium, and beneath my fingertips lay a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. The guests thought the envelope contained a ceremonial check. Evelyn thought it contained her ultimate victory. What they did not know was that the envelope contained undeniable, certified banking ledgers proving a massive federal wire fraud scheme. It contained the exact legal documentation that was about to strip my mother of her wealth, her pristine reputation, and her freedom. I was holding the executioner's axe over my own family, and I was about to drop it on live microphones. Before I tell you exactly what was inside that envelope and how my mother's wealthy friends reacted when the truth was projected across the ballroom, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Do this only if my story hits close to home for you, or if you know what it feels like to be the invisible child in your own home. Also, drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments right now. I always wonder what age you have to be to finally realize that family is a choice, not a bloodline. To understand how I ended up standing on that stage, preparing to destroy my mother's life, you have to rewind exactly 3 months to the rainiest, coldest Tuesday in Boston, and the exact moment my family showed me who they truly were. My name is Clara Bennett. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior structural engineer for a commercial development firm. My life was built on cold, hard mathematics, structural integrity, and thousands of hours of relentless work. I grew up in a sprawling, historic estate in Beacon Hill, surrounded by antique furniture, original crown molding, and an illusion of endless wealth. But the wealth did not belong to me. In the Bennett household, love, resources, and respect were strictly reserved for one person, my brother, Nolan. Nolan was the golden child. He was the sun around which my mother, Evelyn, forcefully revolved. When Nolan turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new luxury SUV and threw a lavish party catered by a 5-star hotel. When I turned 16, I asked my mother for $75 to pay for an advanced calculus prep course. She laughed, called me a financial burden, and told me that if I wanted to waste time on extra classes, I could pay for them myself by scrubbing the estate's massive kitchen floors. I learned very early on that I was not a daughter. I was an obligation. I was the scapegoat, the quiet shadow expected to absorb their stress and demand nothing in return. While Nolan spent his 20s dropping out of expensive private universities and taking luxury vacations to Europe funded by my mother's credit cards, I took the subway. I worked double shifts at a diner, smelling like stale grease and cheap coffee, just to afford my textbooks at MIT. I earned my engineering degree through scholarships, sleep deprivation, and a desperate, burning desire to become completely independent. I never asked them for a dime, and they never offered one. The only person in that cold, cavernous house who ever saw me was my father, Thomas. He was a quiet, pragmatic man who had built a lucrative commercial real estate portfolio from scratch. He was the one who taught me about load-bearing walls, foundations, and how to spot dry rot hidden behind expensive, fresh paint. But Thomas was a passive man. He hated conflict, so he retreated into his study, allowing Evelyn's toxic favoritism to rule the household. Everything changed when my father fell ill. It was a slow, aggressive neurological decline that required full-time, specialized medical care. The moment the medical bills started piling up, the fragile illusion of our family's infinite wealth shattered. Evelyn was terrified, not of losing her husband, but of losing her lifestyle. She panicked at the thought of having to sell her designer clothes or cancel her expensive country club memberships to pay for Thomas's treatments. Nolan, predictably, claimed the hospital environment was too depressing for his mental health and completely vanished, spending his days at upscale cafes. They abandoned him, so I stepped up. I was the scapegoat, but I was also the only one in the family with a steady, high-paying career and a rigid moral compass. I moved back into the suffocating Beacon Hill estate. I opened a joint family checking account with Evelyn to streamline my father's medical expenses. Over the course of 2 grueling years, I deposited every single dollar of my life savings into that account. I paid the exorbitant mortgage on the Beacon Hill house. I paid the private nurses. I paid for the imported medications. I worked 80-hour weeks at my engineering firm, coming home exhausted, only to spend my nights reviewing my father's medical charts. I drained my own future to keep a roof over their heads. I handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what did Evelyn and Nolan do? They played the role of the devoted, grief-stricken family for their high society friends. Evelyn hosted elegant luncheons in the garden I was paying for, crying delicate tears about the heavy burden of being a caregiver. Nolan posted heavily filtered, melancholy photos on his social media, curating an audience of sympathetic followers who praised his bravery. They spent their days projecting an image of pure, selfless devotion while completely ignoring the daughter who was bleeding herself dry to fund their reality. I thought my financial sacrifice would finally earn me a sliver of their respect. I thought they would eventually see my worth. I was wrong. Their cruelty was not born of stress. It was ingrained in their bones. And the moment my father took his final breath, they did not just mourn. They executed a trap they had been planning for months, a betrayal so vicious and calculated that it almost destroyed my mind. The day we buried my father, the Boston sky was a bruised, heavy purple, and a thick, freezing fog rolled off the harbor, dampening the black wool of my mourning dress. We stood under a canopy of dark umbrellas at the historic Mount Auburn Cemetery. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying autumn leaves. I stood close to the edge of the grave, my chest hollowed out by a grief so profound it made my bones ache. My father was the only person in that sprawling, cold family who had ever looked at me and seen a human being instead of a tool to be used. And now, he was gone. I expected my mother and brother to at least pretend to mourn. I expected them to maintain the pristine, high society facade they valued above all else. But as the heavy mahogany casket was slowly lowered into the ground, I heard a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a laugh, a soft, breathy, amused chuckle. I turned my head slightly. Standing just 5 feet away, partially shielded by a massive black umbrella, were Evelyn and Nolan. Nolan was not looking at the grave. He was casually scrolling through his smartphone, his thumbs moving rapidly across the glowing screen. I could see the reflection in his expensive sunglasses. He was browsing a luxury dealership's website, zooming in on the custom leather interior of a brand new Porsche. Evelyn was leaning into his shoulder, whispering excitedly into his ear. I strained to hear her words over the sound of the freezing rain. "We can liquidate the Cape Cod property by next month," she murmured, her voice vibrating with a greedy, frantic energy. And the accounts, finally. We don't have to pretend to budget anymore. They were not mourning a husband or a father. They were celebrating a massive financial windfall. They were standing over his open grave, practically vibrating with the anticipation of spending the wealth they believed was now fully theirs. I felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. I turned back to the grave, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, refusing to let them see me cry. I assumed their callousness was the worst thing I would experience that day. I was entirely, catastrophically wrong. 2 hours later, I drove my beat-up 7-year-old sedan back to the Beacon Hill estate. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. I just wanted to retreat to my childhood bedroom, take off my damp dress, and sleep for a week. I turned onto the private cobblestone driveway and hit the brakes. My car skidded slightly on the wet stones. There, sitting on the pristine, manicured lawn in the pouring rain, was a mountain of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. Some of them were tied haphazardly. Others had ripped open, spilling their contents onto the wet grass. I saw my favorite wool sweaters, my engineering textbooks, and a framed photograph of me and my father soaking in the muddy puddles. I threw the car into park and stumbled out into the freezing downpour. I ran toward the porch, my mind unable to process the visual reality of my entire life discarded like actual trash. Standing on the covered porch, entirely shielded from the rain, were Evelyn and Nolan. Evelyn was no longer wearing her black veil. She held a crystal glass of expensive red wine, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Nolan stood beside her, leaning casually against the original oak columns, a smug, predatory smile stretching across his face. "What is this?" I screamed, my voice cracking against the wind. "What are you doing?" "My things are being ruined." "Your things are exactly where they belong," Evelyn said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her voice was ice. "The charity case is closed, Clara. Your father is gone, which means my obligation to tolerate your miserable, depressing presence in this house has officially expired. This is my home," I shouted, stepping up onto the first wooden stair. "I paid the mortgage on this house for the last 2 years. I paid for Dad's nurses. I drained my savings for this family." Nolan let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You didn't pay for anything, Clara. You just facilitated the transfers. It was family money." "It was my money," I cried, panic finally bleeding into my voice. "It was my engineering salary. All of it is in our joint account." I pulled my phone from my damp coat pocket, my fingers shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I opened my banking application to show them the joint account balance, the account I had poured over $200,000 into. The screen loaded, the numbers flashed in bright, bold font. 0. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I refreshed the application. I checked my personal checking account. 0.00. I checked my emergency savings. $0.0. Everything was gone. Every single cent I had earned through double shifts, sleepless nights, and grueling corporate contracts had been completely wiped out. "Where is it?" I whispered, looking up at them. The rain plastered my dark hair to my face. "Where is my money?" Nolan reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. He didn't hand it to me. He simply held it up so I could see the bold, notarized seal at the bottom. "It's a comprehensive power of attorney," Nolan sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Dad signed it 3 weeks ago. It grants Mom complete, irrevocable control over all family assets, including any joint accounts bearing your name. We authorized an emergency sweep of the funds this morning to cover outstanding medical debts. Legally speaking, Clara, you are broke." My mind spun. I remembered 3 weeks ago. My father had been on a heavy dose of intravenous morphine, completely incoherent and slipping in and out of consciousness. He couldn't even hold a cup of water, let alone read and sign a complex legal document. "That's a forgery," I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "He was medicated. He didn't sign that. You forged his signature and committed wire fraud." Evelyn's eyes flashed with a dangerous, toxic fury. "Prove it," she hissed. Try to prove it with $0 in your bank account. Try to hire a lawyer when you can't even afford a hot meal. You are nothing without this family, Clara. You are a stubborn, ungrateful parasite, and I am finally cutting you off. She turned her back on me. Nolan offered a mock salute, stepped inside the warm, brightly lit foyer, and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, metallic click. I was left standing on the wet cobblestones in a freezing Boston downpour. I was 31 years old, wearing a soaked morning dress, staring at my entire life stuffed into garbage bags. My family had not just evicted me, they had financially executed me. They believed they had stripped me of all my power. But they forgot one crucial detail. They forgot that I was a structural engineer. I knew exactly how to dismantle a house from the inside out. That night, I slept in a damp $80 a night motel off the interstate in Revere. The contrast was physically jarring. I had gone from the historic vaulted ceilings of a Beacon Hill estate to a room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. The neon vacancy sign outside my thin window buzzed relentlessly, casting a harsh, flickering red light across the peeling wallpaper. I sat cross-legged on the sagging mattress, staring at the garbage bags I had dragged into the room. I had exactly $12 in cash in my purse. My credit cards were declining. My bank accounts were frozen and drained. Nolan and Evelyn had executed a flawless surgical strike on my resources, knowing that in the American legal system, justice usually favors the party who can afford to keep the billing meter running. They assumed the sheer panic of poverty would break my spirit and force me to disappear. I pulled a small, worn cardboard box from one of the trash bags. It was the only thing I cared about saving from the wet driveway. Inside the box were old university textbooks, a few faded photographs, and a vintage, heavy brass drafting compass. My father had given me that compass when I was 14 years old. He found me crying in the garage after Evelyn had mocked my clothes in front of her country club friends. He had placed the heavy brass instrument in my palm and closed my fingers around it. Clara, his voice echoed in the quiet, dim motel room. People like your mother and brother, they are obsessed with the paint, the crown molding, the shiny veneer. They build their lives on illusions. But you are load-bearing. You look at the foundation. A cheap veneer always peels when you apply heat, but structural integrity endures everything. Never trust the surface. I held the brass compass in the flickering red light. I ran my thumb over the cold metal. It was a beautiful, antique piece, but it was unusually heavy. I remembered my father's words. Never trust the surface. I gripped the two legs of the compass and twisted the top hinge counterclockwise. It was stiff, resisting at first, but then it gave way with a soft click. The rounded brass top unscrewed completely. The compass was hollow. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned it over and tapped it against my palm. A tightly rolled piece of thick, cream-colored stationery slid out into my hand. My hands were shaking as I unrolled the paper. It wasn't a sentimental letter. It was a formal legal business card, completely blank except for a name, a phone number, and a specific string of 12 alphanumeric characters written in my father's sharp, deliberate handwriting. Arthur Vance, Sterling and Vance Corporate Law, Boston Financial District, access code 77BH902. My father knew. Even in his declining health, sitting quietly in his study while Evelyn and Nolan plotted their theft, he knew exactly what they were going to do. And he didn't just leave me a warning, he left me a weapon. The next morning, I put on my only dry professional outfit, a sensible gray blazer and slacks, and drove my rusted sedan into the heart of the Boston Financial District. The Sterling and Vance building was a towering monolith of mirrored glass and steel. It was the kind of law firm that handled multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers, not petty family disputes. I walked into the polished marble lobby, acutely aware of my scuffed shoes. I handed the receptionist the vintage business card. She didn't ask for my ID. She simply saw the handwriting, nodded briskly, and escorted me to a private biometric elevator. Arthur Vance was a formidable man in his late 60s. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and possessed the sharp, assessing gaze of a predator. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk on the 42nd floor, overlooking the Boston Harbor. "Your father was a brilliant, pragmatic man, Clara," Mr. Vance said, pouring a glass of water from a crystal carafe. He knew Evelyn was unstable. He knew Nolan was a parasite. And he knew that the moment he died, they would attempt to steal your resources to fund their lifestyle. "They succeeded," I said, my voice tight. "They forged a power of attorney and drained my joint account. They hold the deed to the Beacon Hill house. I have nothing." Mr. Vance smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "They hold the deed to the physical structure, Clara. But your father built his wealth in commercial real estate. He knew that the deed tells you who bought the paint, but the master lease tells you who owns the dirt." He opened a thick blue leather portfolio and slid it across the desk. 10 years ago, your father quietly transferred the 2 acres of prime historic land beneath the Beacon Hill estate into a blind trust, Mr. Vance explained, tapping a manicured finger on the dense legal jargon. "He named you as the sole, irrevocable beneficiary, to be activated immediately upon his death. Evelyn owns the bricks, but you own the ground she sleeps on. And according to the commercial master lease your father set up, the tenant of the physical structure is required to pay an annual ground rent and all municipal property taxes to the trust." I stared at the paperwork. The realization was dizzying. "Have they been paying the ground rent?" I asked, my pulse accelerating. "No," Mr. Vance said, his eyes gleaming. "Evelyn and Nolan haven't paid a dime in property taxes or ground rent for 4 years. They assumed the debt would just vanish when Thomas died. Under Massachusetts commercial real estate law, they are in severe, inexcusable financial default. You are legally their landlord, Clara, and you hold the unilateral right to evict them." The air left my lungs. My family had thrown me on the street like garbage, entirely unaware that I owned the street. "But that isn't the best part," Mr. Vance continued, pulling out a second, thinner folder. "When Evelyn and Nolan used that forged power of attorney to drain your joint account, they didn't just commit a family betrayal. They moved the money across state lines into an offshore holding account Nolan set up in Delaware. They utilized electronic banking infrastructure to do it." I looked up at him, the pieces snapping together with lethal precision. "Wire fraud." "Federal wire fraud," Mr. Vance corrected. "And embezzlement. I have the bank routing logs right here, secured before they could cover their digital tracks. We have undeniable proof of multiple federal felonies. They didn't just steal your money, Clara. They handed you the exact legal mechanism required to send them both to federal prison for the next 20 years. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The trauma and the fear that had been suffocating me for the last 48 hours completely evaporated. I wasn't the helpless, discarded scapegoat anymore. I was holding a loaded financial execution order. "Do we call the police?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, and perfectly cold. "We could," Mr. Vance said, "but a quiet arrest lets them hide behind their lawyers. It lets them play the victim." I looked out the window at the Boston skyline. In 2 months, Evelyn was scheduled to host the Boston Heritage Gala, the most prestigious high society event of the season. She had likely stolen my savings specifically to pay the exorbitant $100,000 sponsorship fee, desperate to stand on a stage and be worshipped by the city's billionaires. "No," I said, looking back at Mr. Vance. "We don't call the police. We wait. We let her spend my stolen money to build her perfect stage. And then I am going to walk up to the microphone and I am going to burn her entire life down in front of everyone she respects." I walked out of Mr. Vance's high-rise office and stepped back into the freezing Boston wind. The heavy leather portfolio containing the master lease and the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud was tucked securely under my arm. A few hours ago, I was a discarded, broken scapegoat shivering in a cheap motel room. Now, I was a loaded weapon. I could have called the police right then. I could have walked into the nearest precinct, dropped the bank ledgers on a detective's desk, and had Evelyn and Nolan arrested before dinner. A quiet, swift legal strike would have been the logical choice. But a quiet strike would have allowed Evelyn to control the narrative. If she was arrested privately, she would simply call her wealthy friends from a holding cell, crying fake tears, spinning a tragic story about a massive misunderstanding and a vindictive, unstable daughter. She would play the victim just as she had done my entire life. I remembered the lesson my father taught me in his study all those years ago. A cheap veneer always peels when you apply intense heat. I didn't want to just peel the veneer in a quiet courtroom. I wanted to drag it under the brightest lights in the city and watch it incinerate. I returned to my dingy, stale-smelling motel room and opened my laptop. I logged into my social media accounts and pulled up Evelyn's public profile. She was a master of the digital illusion. Her feed was a curated gallery of perfection: crystal champagne flutes, expensive floral arrangements, and staged candid photos of her and Nolan looking like mourning, sophisticated aristocrats. Her latest post was a glossy, high-resolution digital flyer for the upcoming Boston Heritage Gala. The caption beneath the image read, "In these dark times, family and charity are the only things that keep us grounded." Nolan and I are incredibly honored to be the primary sponsors for this year's Heritage Gala. We are continuing Thomas's legacy of giving back to this beautiful city. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. The sponsorship tier she had purchased for that gala cost exactly $100,000. She wasn't continuing my father's legacy. She had forged a power of attorney, drained my life savings, and funneled my grueling double shifts and engineering bonuses directly into the gala's catering and venue fees. She was using my blood, sweat, and absolute ruin to buy herself a standing ovation from Boston's billionaire elite. She wanted a spectacle, so I decided to give her one. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I remained completely invisible. I ignored the few passive-aggressive text messages Nolan sent me, demanding I come pick up the rest of my trash from the Beacon Hill driveway. I let them believe I was broken. I let them believe the financial freeze they inflicted on me had successfully starved me into submission. They assumed I was paralyzed by poverty, too weak to hire a lawyer, and too terrified to fight back. But in the shadows, I was working meticulously with Arthur Vance and his team of forensic accountants. We did not file any public lawsuits. We did not send any warning letters. Instead, Mr. Vance legally registered my activation of the Blind Commercial Land Trust. With my authority officially recognized in the subterranean layers of corporate real estate law, I quietly executed a formal notice of default regarding the unpaid ground rent on the Beacon Hill estate. We prepared the eviction documents, stamped with the golden seal of the Massachusetts Superior Court. We gathered the certified routing numbers proving the embezzlement. We assembled an executioner's dossier. The day before the gala, I needed to secure my armor. I was legally the majority shareholder of the trust sponsoring the event, which meant my name was heavily embedded in the venue's VIP registry, bypassing Evelyn entirely. But I needed to look the part. I went to a discreet vintage boutique in downtown Boston. I couldn't afford a brand new designer gown, but my years of analyzing structural integrity and historical architecture had taught me how to spot flawless craftsmanship. I found a stunning, heavy charcoal gray silk gown from the late 1990s. The tailoring was impeccable, featuring clean architectural lines that projected quiet, dangerous authority rather than loud, desperate wealth. It cost me $150, almost the last of my remaining cash, but when I put it on, I didn't see the terrified scapegoat who had been locked out in the rain. I saw the rightful heir to my father's empire. But when it came time to choose my footwear, I stopped. The boutique owner offered me a pair of delicate, strappy silver heels that matched the gown perfectly. I looked down at the floor, and a dark, heavy thought settled into my chest. "No," I told the owner, gently pushing the heels away. "I already have my shoes." I returned to the motel and opened the black plastic garbage bags sitting in the corner of my room. I dug through the wrinkled clothes and ruined textbooks until I found them. my heavy, steel-toed engineering work boots. The leather was scuffed and scarred. The soles were worn down from thousands of hours spent walking across concrete construction sites. They were the exact boots I was wearing when Evelyn hurled my belongings onto the wet cobblestones and told me I was a financial burden. I brushed the dried mud off the laces. Wearing a designer silk gown with battered industrial work boots was a jarring, chaotic contradiction. But I wasn't dressing to impress the high society guests. I was dressing to send a message. When Evelyn looked at my dress, I wanted her to see the power I had reclaimed, but when she looked at my feet, I wanted her to see the exact reality she had forced me to survive. I wanted her to remember the cold, the rain, and the absolute cruelty of her betrayal. My boots were my receipts. The night of the Boston Heritage Gala arrived with a bitter, biting New England chill. The event was held at a sprawling historic hotel situated in the heart of the city's financial district. I ordered a standard, economy rideshare. My dented hybrid taxi pulled into the grand circular driveway, stopping directly behind a line of gleaming, chauffeured black sedans and luxury SUVs. I stepped out into the freezing night air. The heavy charcoal silk of my gown rippled in the wind, brushing against the rough leather of my work boots. I walked past the uniformed valet attendants and ascended the grand marble staircase. The atmosphere inside the lobby was a masterpiece of opulence. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids and winter roses decorated every polished surface. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light across the sea of Boston's most influential politicians, real estate tycoons, and socialites. I handed my cheap wool coat to the attendant at the cloakroom. I did not carry a purse. I only carried the thick, heavily sealed manila envelope containing the legal destruction of the Bennett family. I approached the velvet ropes guarding the entrance to the main ballroom. The security personnel, cross-referencing names on a digital tablet, asked for my invitation. I didn't have a paper invitation. I simply gave them my name and told them to check the primary corporate sponsor registry. The guard typed Clara Bennett into the system. The screen flashed green with elite VIP clearance. He unhooked the velvet rope immediately, offering a respectful nod, completely oblivious to the scuffed boots hidden beneath my elegant hemline. I stepped through the heavy gilded doors and entered the grand ballroom. The noise hit me like a physical wave, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the low hum of wealthy gossip, the soft, classical melody of a live string quartet playing in the corner. I scanned the sprawling room, my eyes sweeping past the politicians and the CEOs until I found them. Evelyn and Nolan were holding court near the center of the room, standing beneath the largest chandelier. Evelyn looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. She was wearing the custom-tailored $10,000 dark, shimmering gown I had seen on her social media. A massive diamond pendant rested against her collarbone. She was laughing, a high, practiced sound, while speaking to a prominent local judge. Nolan stood lazily beside her in a bespoke tuxedo, holding a glass of imported bourbon, looking supremely bored, but reveling in the proximity to immense wealth. They thought they had won. They thought the daughter they had discarded was shivering in a gutter somewhere, permanently erased from their pristine narrative. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and began to walk toward them. My heavy work boots made a dull, rhythmic thud against the polished hardwood floor, a sound completely out of place among the clicking of designer stilettos. It took exactly 30 seconds for Evelyn to notice me. She was raising her champagne glass to her lips when her eyes drifted across the room and locked onto my face. The glass froze in midair. The practiced, benevolent smile instantly shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. The blood drained from her face so fast her heavy makeup suddenly looked like a plastic mask. Nolan followed her gaze. His smug, arrogant posture evaporated. He stood rigidly upright, his grip tightening around his bourbon glass until his knuckles turned stark white. I did not stop. I did not shrink away from their panic. I walked directly into their circle, stopping just 3 feet away from my mother. "Evelyn," I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured, cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom. You're spending my money very well tonight. The orchids are a nice touch." The judge Evelyn had been speaking to blinked in confusion, stepping back slightly as the toxic tension radiated from our interaction. Evelyn quickly turned her back to the judge, stepping aggressively toward me to block his view. Her perfume was thick and suffocating. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn hissed, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper meant only for my ears. "How did you get past the door? You are a disgrace, Clara. You are a trespassing charity case, and I will not allow you to ruin the most important night of my life." Nolan stepped forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You need to leave, right now," he growled, glancing nervously around the room to see who was watching, "before I call security and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." I looked down at the heavy diamond pendant resting on Evelyn's chest. I recognized it. I had seen the exact withdrawal amount for that necklace on the forged bank ledgers Mr. Vance had pulled. "Call them," I challenged, looking right back up into Nolan's eyes. "Call security, Nolan. Tell them the primary shareholder of the trust funding this entire event is trespassing. Let's see who they decide to remove." Evelyn's eyes darted down, finally registering the hem of my silk gown. She saw the scuffed, mud-stained, steel-toed work boots protruding from beneath the charcoal fabric. The visual contradiction short-circuited her brain. It was a blatant, physical mockery of her obsession with high society aesthetics. "You are insane," Evelyn breathed, her chest heaving with a mixture of rage and terror. She frantically waved her hand toward a pair of large security guards stationed near the ballroom doors. "Security. Remove this woman. She is uninvited and emotionally unstable." The two large men in dark suits immediately began navigating through the crowd toward us. Evelyn crossed her arms, a vicious, triumphant smirk briefly returning to her face. She thought the physical force of the guards would silence me. She thought she still controlled the environment. The guards arrived, their expressions stern. "Ma'am," the larger guard said, reaching a hand toward my shoulder, "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply raised my left hand, holding up the thick manila envelope, and looked the guard dead in the eye. "My name is Clara Bennett," I said, my voice projecting with total authority. "I am the legally appointed executive trustee of the Bennett Commercial Land Trust, the platinum sponsor of tonight's gala. If you touch me, my corporate litigators will have your security firm dismantled by Monday morning. Check your VIP manifest." The guard froze. He pressed his earpiece, murmuring a quick question to the front desk. A few seconds later, his eyes widened. He immediately pulled his hand back, taking a respectful step away from me. "My apologies, Ms. Bennett. The stage is yours whenever you are ready." Evelyn let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The realization hit her like a freight train. The social armor she had spent her entire life polishing was completely useless against the raw, undeniable legal power I was wielding. The security guards, the velvet ropes, the high society rules, none of it could protect her from the daughter she had thrown onto the street. I didn't say another word to her. I didn't need to. The total psychological collapse happening in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed. I stepped around my frozen, terrified family. I walked toward the front of the ballroom, ascending the carpeted steps to the main stage. The ambient chatter in the massive room began to fade as the guests noticed the disruption. I walked directly to the polished mahogany podium and adjusted the microphone. I placed the thick manila envelope down on the wood. I looked out at the sea of 300 wealthy guests. And then I looked down at the front row, where Evelyn and Nolan had just been forced to take their seats, staring up at me like prisoners waiting for the guillotine to drop. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. 300 of Boston's most influential figures, real estate tycoons, politicians, and socialites, sat frozen, their eyes locked entirely on me. The ambient clinking of crystal glasses and silver forks had completely ceased. I stood at the polished mahogany podium, the heavy charcoal silk of my gown catching the glare of the stage lights. My hands rested calmly on either side of the thick manila envelope. I looked down at the front row. Evelyn was gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles were stark white. The diamond pendant around her neck, bought with the money she stole from my grueling double shifts, glittered mockingly in the light. Nolan sat beside her, his arrogant smirk entirely erased, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. I leaned forward and adjusted the microphone. The sharp, electronic feedback echoed through the vaulted ceiling. "Good evening," I said, my voice projecting with a cold, steady resonance that commanded the massive room. "My name is Clara Bennett. I am the daughter of the late Thomas Bennett and the legally appointed executive trustee of the Bennett Commercial Land Trust, the primary financial sponsor of tonight's beautiful gala." A polite, hesitant ripple of applause moved through the crowd. They did not know the war that was happening right in front of them. They assumed this was a standard charity speech. They assumed I was here to honor my mother. "Tonight we are here to celebrate generosity," I continued, keeping my gaze locked directly on Evelyn. "We are here to celebrate the Bennett family legacy. My mother, Evelyn, and my brother, Nolan, have spent the last 3 months telling everyone in this room about their profound sacrifices. They have painted themselves as devoted caregivers, mourning a tragic loss, while generously funding the $100,000 sponsorship required to bring you all here tonight." Evelyn's chest heaved. She tried to catch the eye of the event coordinator standing near the side stage, silently pleading for someone to cut the audio feed. But I was the platinum sponsor. No one was going to touch that soundboard. "But true generosity," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, clinical register, "requires you to actually spend your own money." I opened the manila envelope. I pulled out the forged power of attorney and the certified banking ledgers. I didn't just hold them up. I turned to the audiovisual technician operating the massive digital projector behind the stage. I had handed his team a USB drive 10 minutes before walking into the ballroom. I gave the technician a sharp nod. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. The first document projected in bright, glowing 20-foot letters was the forged power of attorney. 3 months ago, right after my father's funeral, my mother and brother threw my belongings into garbage bags and left me on a freezing, wet driveway, I said, my words slicing through the breathless silence of the ballroom. They told me I was a financial burden. But the truth is, I spent the last 2 years paying their mortgage. I drained my entire life savings, working 80-hour weeks as a structural engineer to pay for my father's medical care. I clicked a remote on the podium. The screen transitioned to the bank routing ledgers. I used a digital laser pointer to highlight the massive outbound transfers. "This is the joint account I funded to keep them from going bankrupt," I announced, letting the undeniable numbers hang over the room. "And these are the routing logs proving that while my father was incapacitated on heavy medication, Nolan forged his signature. They illegally drained $200,000 of my money and funneled it into a private shell account to pay for Evelyn's designer dresses, Nolan's luxury car leases, and the very catering you are currently eating." The ballroom erupted. The polite, high society facade instantly shattered. Gasps of horror and loud, disgusted whispers swept across the tables. These were wealthy people who ruthlessly protected their own assets. There was nothing they despised more than a fraud. Evelyn leaped from her chair. The $10,000 shimmering dark gown suddenly looked absurd against the backdrop of her undeniable crimes. "She is lying," Evelyn shrieked, her voice shrill and frantic, echoing uncomfortably through the large room. "She is a disturbed, vindictive girl. She fabricated those documents because she is jealous of this family. Security, turn off that screen immediately." Nolan stood up, trying to physically intimidate me from the floor. "Turn the mic off, Clara," he yelled, his face a mottled, terrified red. "You are embarrassing yourself. You have no proof. I have the forensic accounting certified by Arthur Vance, senior partner at Sterling and Vance," I replied calmly, dropping the name of the most feared corporate litigator in Boston. The mention of Arthur Vance was a guillotine. The prominent judge sitting at Evelyn's table, the man she had been trying to impress all night, slowly put down his champagne glass. He looked at the projected bank logs, recognizing the certified federal routing stamps. He physically pushed his chair away from Evelyn, putting distance between himself and a documented felon. "But the embezzlement is only half the story," I said, turning the screw tighter. "You see, Evelyn and Nolan were so obsessed with projecting wealth that they forgot to check the foundation of the house they were living in." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen flashed to the original 1998 commercial master lease established by my father. "My father knew exactly who you were, Evelyn," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "He knew you would steal the physical deed to the Beacon Hill mansion the second he died. But he didn't leave you the foundation. He placed the 2 acres of historic land beneath the estate into a blind commercial trust. He left the dirt to me." Evelyn stopped screaming. The blood completely drained from her face. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the impact. "You don't own the estate," I told her, the microphone carrying my words to every corner of the room. "You are just my tenant, and according to the tax records on that screen, you have defaulted on 4 years of ground rent. You are occupying property that belongs to my trust, and you are entirely bankrupt." I reached into the envelope and pulled out a crisp, gold-sealed legal document. "This is a formal, court-ordered notice of default and eviction," I announced, stepping out from behind the podium. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at my brother and mother. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property before the county sheriff physically removes you." Nolan stumbled backward, bumping into the table and knocking over a crystal vase. The water spilled across the ivory silk tablecloth, dripping onto his bespoke tuxedo shoes. "You can't do this," he choked out, the arrogant golden child reduced to a trembling, helpless boy. "Where are we supposed to go? We don't have any money." "You should have thought about that before you stole mine," I replied, my voice devoid of any pity. Evelyn tried to deploy her final weapon. She pressed her hand to her chest, letting out a theatrical, breathless gasp, attempting to fake a panic attack to garner sympathy from the crowd. She swayed on her feet, waiting for someone, anyone, to rush forward and catch her. No one moved. The billionaires, the politicians, and the socialites just stared at her with cold, calculating disgust. They saw the projected evidence of wire fraud. They saw the scuffed, battered, steel-toed work boots protruding from beneath my elegant silk gown, the undeniable physical proof of the cruelty she had inflicted upon me. The veneer had completely peeled away, and the ugly, rotting particle board beneath was exposed for the entire city to see. "Save the performance, Evelyn," I said, turning my back on her and walking back to the podium. "You're going to need your energy, because the police officers waiting in the lobby right now aren't here for a noise complaint. They are here to execute a federal warrant for wire fraud and embezzlement." Evelyn let out a raw, jagged scream of pure terror. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 3 uniformed Boston police officers, accompanied by a plainclothes federal detective, walked purposefully down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them immediately. Evelyn frantically grabbed Nolan's arm, pulling him toward the side exit, but 2 security guards, the same guards she had tried to command earlier, stepped in front of the doors, blocking their escape. The detective approached Evelyn. He did not care about her $10,000 gown. He did not care about the crystal chandeliers. He pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed sharply as he secured them around my mother's wrists. Another officer grabbed Nolan, pressing him against the linen-draped table to cuff him. "Clara, please," Evelyn sobbed, her high society mask entirely obliterated, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. "I'm your mother. You can't let them do this to me. Tell them it's a mistake." I stood on the stage, looking down at the woman who had laughed at my father's funeral. I looked at the brother who had thrown my engineering degree into the freezing rain. "I told you," I said, my voice echoing one last time through the silent, watching ballroom. "The charity case is officially closed." I watched as the police escorted them out of the ballroom. Evelyn was weeping hysterically, her head bowed in absolute, inescapable humiliation. Nolan was completely silent, his eyes wide with the realization that his life of unearned luxury was permanently over. They were paraded past the very people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress, hauled out through the grand lobby, and shoved into the back of a waiting squad car. I stood at the podium, the heavy manila envelope empty, the massive screen behind me still glowing with the undeniable truth. The war was over. I had built my own table, and I had just removed their seats permanently. The legal system usually grinds forward at a sluggish, agonizing pace, but it operates with terrifying, ruthless velocity when a corporate attorney like Arthur Vance hands a fully documented federal wire fraud case to the authorities. The 30 days following the Boston Heritage Gala were a masterclass in total financial and social annihilation for the family that had tried to destroy me. Evelyn and Nolan did not go to trial. People who spend their entire lives performing wealth for their neighbors rarely possess the actual psychological fortitude required to face a federal judge and a jury of their peers. When the federal prosecutors laid out the undeniable paper trail, the forged power of attorney, the bank routing numbers, the stolen medical funds, and the unpaid commercial ground rent, their high-priced defense attorneys advised an immediate, unconditional surrender. To avoid a mandatory 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, my mother and brother were forced to sign a comprehensive plea agreement. The financial penalty was staggering. The court ordered them to immediately liquidate their entire remaining estate to pay full restitution to my trust. The sprawling, historic Beacon Hill mansion, the house I had bled myself dry to save, was seized by the federal authorities to satisfy their massive debts. I did not attend the estate liquidation auction, but Mr. Vance's associates sent me the final reports. They described the scene with cold, clinical detachment. Strangers walked through the grand, antique-filled foyer, tracking mud across the expensive hardwood floors my mother had prized above her own daughter. Bargain hunters picked through Evelyn's massive walk-in closet, offering absolute pennies on the dollar for her custom-tailored silk gowns and cashmere sweaters. The $10,000 dark, shimmering dress she wore to the gala was sold in a cardboard box for $50. The luxury sports car Nolan had been looking at on his phone during my father's funeral was never purchased. Instead, the bank repossessed the expensive SUV he already drove. A tow truck driver backed right into the cobblestone driveway and hooked the pristine luxury vehicle onto a winch while the wealthy Beacon Hill neighbors stood on their porches and watched. Evelyn tried to close the heavy velvet blinds to hide her shame, but the damage was permanent. They were completely, irrevocably bankrupt. They moved out of Beacon Hill on a rainy Tuesday morning. Because I had legally frozen their subsidiary accounts, they could not afford to hire a professional, discreet luxury moving service. They were reduced to utilizing whatever materials they could find. They hauled their remaining possessions out to the curb in heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. The visual symmetry was flawless. The universe possesses a remarkable, almost terrifying sense of poetry when delivering justice. They were carrying the ruined, discarded remnants of their lives in the exact same garbage bags they had used to pack up my life when they threw me onto the street. Today, my mother and brother occupy a very different reality. Evelyn relocated to a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a decaying, outdated complex near an industrial park in South Boston. The building has stained carpets, peeling paint, and a direct view of a noisy, exhaust-choked interstate highway. The air inside her apartment smells of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floor wax, a stark and brutal departure from the imported orchids and vanilla she used to surround herself with. The high society friends she spent decades trying to impress completely abandoned her. Her name was quietly scrubbed from the exclusive country club registry the exact week the viral footage of her arrest began circulating among the Boston elite. She spends her days clipping grocery coupons, hiding behind large sunglasses if she ever has to walk into a discount supermarket, terrified of being recognized. Nolan experienced an even more profound and agonizing awakening. The golden child was meticulously conditioned his entire life to receive resources, never to provide them. He was raised to believe the world existed merely to serve his aesthetic desires and fund his laziness. Stripped of his trust fund, his luxury cars, and his mother's stolen credit cards, Nolan had to face the brutal reality of the working class. He now works a grueling minimum wage job at a massive discount retail chain. He stands on his feet for 8 hours a day, wearing a scratchy, ill-fitting polyester uniform, folding sweaters, organizing inventory, and dealing with impatient, demanding customers. The man who used to laugh at my grueling double shifts as an engineer now cleans the very floors he used to walk on. I often think back to the afternoon of my father's funeral. I remember sitting on the wet concrete in my black mourning dress, shivering in the freezing New England fog, staring at the garbage bags holding my life, and feeling an unbearable, suffocating sense of rejection. I spent 30 years of my life trying to earn a place at a dining table where the chairs were always deliberately pulled away from me. I bent over backward to accommodate their cruelty. I drained my own bank accounts and sacrificed my youth, hoping my quiet compliance and my financial sacrifices would eventually be rewarded with basic human affection. Navigating this brutal corporate war and dissecting their financial fraud taught me a vital, life-altering lesson about human nature. My mother and brother did not reject me because I was unworthy of love. They rejected me because my presence acted as a mirror, reflecting the hollow, rotting reality of their own lives. Evelyn wore expensive diamonds to mask her profound, crippling insecurity. Nolan acted arrogant because he lacked genuine competence or purpose. They functioned as parasites, feeding on the legacy of a hardworking man and exploiting the daughter who actually possessed structural integrity. When Evelyn looked at me, she saw a woman trained to spot a fake. That was the real reason I was exiled from the Beacon Hill estate. I was load-bearing, and they were made of cheap, peeling veneer. I sit now in the quiet warmth of my own home. I did not move back into the Beacon Hill mansion. The memories in those walls were too toxic, too stained with their cruelty. Instead, I sold the physical structure and used the massive capital from the commercial land trust to establish my own independent structural engineering firm. My office is located in a beautifully restored historic building overlooking the Boston Harbor. I sit behind a sturdy, solid oak desk. It is an authentic 19th century piece. I tolerate no cheap veneers in this office. The desk is solid wood, built by craftsmen who understood how to construct something capable of withstanding the relentless pressure of time. On the corner of the polished mahogany surface rests the heavy, antique brass drafting compass my father gave me. The cold metal catches the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It is a daily, grounding reminder that true value endures, while cheap imitations inevitably shatter on the pavement. I built a new life not by seeking vindictive, chaotic revenge, but by simply refusing to participate in their delusion. I stopped paying for their lies. They told me I was a financial burden, like it was a curse. They didn't realize it was my greatest protection. Family is not defined by shared DNA, an accident of birth, or the name on a legal document. Family is defined by shared respect, mutual empathy, and unconditional fairness. There is a certain mythology woven into the fabric of the traditional family. We are conditioned from a young age to believe that the bond between parent and child is an unbreakable sanctuary. We are told that blood is thicker than water. But what happens when that sanctuary is built on a foundation of lies, favoritism, and emotional exploitation? The story of the Bennett family, a narrative of embezzlement, stolen life savings, and a high society takedown, forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about parenting, responsibility, and the generational trauma that festers behind closed, expensive doors. In the heart of these family tragedies lies a toxic psychological dynamic that destroys the very essence of a child's soul, the rigid casting of the golden child and the scapegoat. In a healthy family structure, parents guide their children with fairness, holding them accountable for their mistakes while loving them equally. But in dysfunctional narcissistic systems, one child is elevated to a pedestal, shielded from consequences, and showered with endless attention and stolen resources. This golden child becomes the vessel for the parent's fragile ego. Their mistakes are covered up at any cost, even if it means forging medical documents, emptying joint bank accounts, or outright lying to protect a pristine public image. Conversely, the scapegoat is forced to carry the crushing, suffocating weight of the family's dysfunctions. If you are the scapegoat, you are the designated shock absorber for every failure and resentment in the household. You learn devastatingly early that your worth is not inherent, but rather measured by how useful you are to others. You become the acceptable sacrifice when the golden child's comfort or the family's reputation is at stake. You are expected to be the quiet helper, the one who cleans up the messes, the one who hands over their hard-earned paycheck, treated like free help rather than a beloved member of the household. This dynamic is a profound failure of family responsibility. It teaches the golden child that they are above the law, breeding a fragile, toxic entitlement that completely collapses the moment they face the unyielding reality of the real world. And it teaches the scapegoat that love is a transaction, a massive, unpayable debt they must continuously service but can never fully settle. True parenting requires a bedrock of honesty, fairness, and acute emotional awareness. It demands the courage to let children fail and learn, rather than orchestrating elaborate criminal cover-ups to preserve a country club facade. When parents choose their own comfort, their designer dresses, and their social standing over the emotional safety of their children, they do not just fail as guides. They become predators. They create an environment where a child spends decades shrinking themselves to fit into a mold, swallowing their hurt, and apologizing for having feelings. We live in a culture profoundly obsessed with the curb appeal of our lives. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, it is so easy to fall into the trap of manicuring the front lawn while completely ignoring the slow, creeping, dry rot festering behind the pristine drywall. We want the perfect holiday card photos, the luxury SUVs parked in the driveway, and the outward assurance that we have succeeded. But when the storms come, and they always do, a house is not held up by a fresh coat of expensive paint. It is held up by its structural integrity. If you are listening to this story right now, and you recognize this dark pattern, if you feel the familiar, deep ache of being the outcast in your own home, I need you to hear these words. They will tell you that you are difficult to love. They will tell you that you are a burden. They will weaponize their basic decency and demand you pay them back with your soul. They will make you feel like you owe them your silence, your obedience, and your future, just because they put a roof over your head or didn't throw you on the street sooner. Do not believe them. Abuse disguised as charity is still abuse. Embezzlement disguised as parenting is still theft. You do not owe loyalty to people who use your existence to fund their own vanity. You do not owe gratitude to people who break your legs and then demand a thank you note for handing you a pair of cheap crutches. I used to think walking away was a sign of failure. I used to think if I just scrubbed the floors harder, worked longer shifts, and smiled brighter, they would finally see my worth. I thought if I made myself small enough, they would eventually make room for me. That is the trap. They do not want you to fit in. They want you to stay small so they can feel tall. They need your insecurity to feed their fragile, massive egos. Walking away from the people who share your DNA is the most terrifying journey you will ever embark upon, but it is also the ultimate act of self-preservation. You have the unalienable right to build your own sanctuary. You are the only person who dictates your value. You hold the pen that writes the final chapter of your story. It might take time. It might require you to wear scuffed, mud-stained work boots while you wait for the right moment. It might require you to stand in the shadows and let them build their own gallows. But the truth always surfaces. The receipts always clear. Have you ever had to build your own table because your family deliberately denied you a seat at theirs? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to save your own sanity? Share your boundary-setting stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and it helps to know we are not alone in this fight. If my journey of reclaiming my worth and exposing toxic family dynamics resonated with you today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the complex, sometimes dark, but always illuminating corners of family dynamics and personal vindication, bringing you narratives that empower you to choose yourself. As we step back and view the canvas of our own lives, the story of the Bennett family lingers in the quiet spaces of our minds. It invites us to walk through the hallways of our own homes and examine the foundations we have laid. Are we passing down a legacy of sturdy, authentic oak, or are we simply polishing a cheap veneer, hoping the intense heat never comes? When the grand high society galas end, when the digital screens go dark, and when the bank accounts are officially frozen, all that remains is the undeniable, naked truth of our character. Listen closely to the quiet moments in your own living room. Is that the sound of a strong, unbreakable bond holding your family together? Or is it just the steady, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch, counting down the seconds until the truth is finally revealed? The choice, ultimately, lies in the silence between our heartbeats.